Welcome back to Road of Gojira, the series where we take a road trip down Godzilla's lengthy history. In the last 4 episodes, we took an extensive look of the original 1954 classic, Gojira. This time we're looking at how a somber anti-nuclear horror film transformed into mindless entertainment. Gojira was a financial success in Japan, and the big guy was about to take his first steps towards international fame. But a Japanese movie making it big in America wasn't going to be an easy task. In the 1940s and early 50s, Japanese films had very limited exposure in the United States. Outside of a few major cities, they were rarely shown, and when they were, it was typically in art house cinemas or small independent theaters that catered to niche audiences. These venues weren't widely accessible to the average American moviegoer. It wasn't until the surprise success of Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon that Japanese cinema began to gain recognition in the West. Toho established a US-based subsidiary in Los Angeles, whose primary objective was to oversee the marketing, licensing, and distribution of Toho's films in the American market. Gojira received a limited US release in 1955 in its original uncut form. The movie had gotten some attention, but the real breakthrough was just around the corner, as a man named Edmund Goldman stumbled across the film and saw real potential in it. He reached out to Toho and struck a deal, buying the US theatrical and TV rights for $25,000. The only problem was, Goldman wasn't exactly sure on how to release the picture. His expertise was selling and distributing Hollywood films overseas, not so much handling the releases back home. Realizing this, Goldman got in contact with Harold Ross and Richard Kay of Jewel Enterprises, whom were veterans in distributing foreign films for the West. In fact, Goldman just flat out sold the rights to them. Once Ross and Kay had the rights, they started looking for additional funding and a solid distribution partner. They pitched the film to Joseph Levine, a well-known producer and distributor who saw potential in the project. He agreed to invest $100,000 in exchange for a 50% stake in the US rights. Now, there was no way they were going to mass market a subtitled Japanese film to American audiences in the 1950s. That just wasn't going to fly at the time. So instead of just slapping on some subtitles and calling it a day, Ross, Kay, and Levine took a much more hands-on approach. They completely reworked the film to make it more palatable for an American audience. This involved casting an American lead for newly shot scenes, dubbing over some of the Japanese dialogue, and giving the film a new, punchier title. Paul B. Schreibman, Toho's entertainment lawyer in LA, brought in Canadian-American actor Raymond Burr to play the film's American lead, alongside some additional characters who provided supporting roles. Richard Kay and Harold Ross brought in Terry O'Morse to direct the new scenes, working alongside TV writer Al C. Ward on the script. Morse was chosen mainly for his editing skills, so he not only shot the new footage, but also recut the original Japanese film to create a version that would work around these new sequences. The English dubbing for the movie was done in a quick one-session marathon, lasting about 5 hours. Terry Turner, who had previously managed the 1952 re-release campaign for King Kong, came on as executive producer for the project. He brought many of those same promotional tactics from Kong to the table, spearheading the marketing campaign that helped introduce Gojira, or as I'll call him from now on, Godzilla, to American audiences. In case you're wondering, no. The name change from Gojira to Godzilla wasn't actually made by anyone directly involved in the Americanization of the film. Just like with the original name Gojira, the story behind Godzilla is a bit confusing, and there's no one clear origin as to how that name came to be. Most sources suggest the name likely came from Toho's international division. It may have been derived from the English rendering of Gojira's 3 katakana characters, Gojira, which can resemble the syllables Godzilla when romanized. And here's where it gets a little tricky. There are actually a few different systems for turning Japanese sounds into English letters. The G in Gojira sometimes is written as this or this, and occasionally even this. So spelling it as Godzilla with that hard Z in the middle might just reflect one of those older or alternate romanizations. It's not the official standard, but it's not totally random either. Another version credits Iwao Mori, who was head of Toho's production department at the time. According to some accounts, Mori was shown a few possible English versions of the name. This included Gojira, Godzilla, and Godzilla. He reportedly liked the inclusion of God in Godzilla, but after hearing feedback from a foreign associate, he decided to add a Z for impact, creating the now iconic name Godzilla. I know we've kinda gone off track here, but one last thing about the name. Gojira and Godzilla are technically different names, but at the same time they're also the same name. Yeah, it's a little confusing to say out loud, but whenever you translate Gojira from katakana, it almost always ends up as Godzilla. And some stories even include both names depending on the context, including this movie we're about to talk about. It might seem a little inconsistent, but honestly, it's nothing to stress over. Call him Gojira, call him Godzilla, Toho sees them as one and the same, so why shouldn't we?
It's Gojira! Godzilla!
Anyway, as part of its Americanization, Gojira was rebranded as Godzilla the Sea Beast, or at least that was considered a name, until the much better Godzilla King of the Monsters title came into effect. The movie premiered on April 4th, 1956 at Lowe State Theater in Times Square, New York City. After its Times Square debut, the film rolled out to theaters nationwide, marking Godzilla's official introduction to American audiences. Much like its Japanese counterpart, Godzilla King of the Monsters didn't receive glowing reviews when it was first released, and today most fans don't consider it superior to the original Japanese film. While it tells the same basic story, the American adaptation makes enough changes through editing, added scenes, and tonal shifts that it ends up feeling like an entirely different movie. So let's take a closer look at just how different this version really is. While on his way to Cairo, American journalist Steve Martin makes a quick stop to Japan to catch up with an old college friend. But his visit takes a dramatic turn when a massive sea monster named Godzilla emerges from the ocean and begins wreaking havoc across the country. One of the first things you'll notice about this version is that it's mostly told through flashbacks. The movie opens up with Godzilla's aftermath on Tokyo, with Steve Martin narrating the destruction, guiding us through everything that led up to it with a lot of narrations. Since the original Japanese version aimed for a documentary-like tone, Martin's role as a journalist chronicling the events fits surprisingly well. His narration doesn't feel out of place, it actually complements the somber, realistic atmosphere of the original. In fact, with a few tweaks to the story, you could almost say this feels like the same movie, retold through another character's perspective. Unfortunately though, that doesn't really work here, because some characters feel noticeably different from how they were in the original, and not in a good way. A clear example is Dr. Serizawa. You know that college friend of Steve Martin? Well, in this version, that's Dr. Serizawa himself. In the original Japanese version, Serizawa is a deeply tragic figure. He lives in isolation and is emotionally distant. His story is one of moral anguish, shaped by post-war trauma, and the heavy ethical responsibility of science. Now, let's just strip all of that away from him in this version, because now he goes on expeditions, has an assistant, and cracks jokes with his old friend Steve. He feels like a completely different guy here. What was once a deeply personal philosophical character has been reshaped into more of an eccentric scientist who keeps brushing off his friend who traveled halfway across the world just to see him. The other characters aren't as badly rewritten as Serizawa, but they still lack the emotional depth they had in the original. Not that they had strong personalities to begin with, but they definitely feel even more hollow in this version. There really isn't much screen time for these characters either. They've clearly been downgraded from main character status to just supporting roles, and the actual side characters from the original film, like Shinkichi and Hagiwara, have been pushed back even further into the background. Ogata also gets lumped in with them, since a lot of his moments are missing too, though to be fair, it's not like he did much anyway. The Japanese film didn't really have a central figure carrying the story. In this version, the new character Steve Martin is unquestionably the main character, and there's rarely a moment in the film where you'll forget that. Since most of the story is told through flashbacks, Martin narrates the majority of the film, which is a clever way to guide non-Japanese speakers through the story. Unlike many later Godzilla dubs, this version retains much of the original Japanese dialogue, but because there are no subtitles, if you don't understand Japanese, a lot of the language will just go right over your head. Now there is English dubbing in the movie, and it's about as convincing as a sock puppet doing Shakespeare.
You must use your oxygen destroyer against Godzilla.
No.
Wow, I forgot how hilariously bad it is. I mean, what do you expect when only 3 people did all the voice acting? To be fair, there isn't much dubbed dialogue, but when the characters suddenly switch from speaking English to Japanese, it really pulls me out of the movie because the voice acting sounds lifeless.
One answer could be that some rare phenomenon of nature.
There's even one part where Serizawa and Emiko suddenly get completely different English voices out of the blue. It's so drastic that I can't even focus on what they're even saying.
I don't know what you are talking about.
Well, must not know of this. Promise to keep my secret.
Apparently the voice actors recorded the dubbing session without any visual references. They stood in a large empty room with only a microphone and a script. Because only a small group of actors handled all the voices, many of the characters ended up sounding very similar. And that's especially noticeable when both Serizawa and Ogata are speaking with each other. Another way the film helps translate the dialogue is through another new character, a Japanese military man named Tomo Iwanaga. Iwanaga becomes a close acquaintance of Martin, and follows him through most of the movie, not only helping him get into certain places, but also providing relevant information to the story. As a character though, he's really nothing more than a walking translator. While I think it's neat that the original language was kept for a good portion of the film, the American filmmakers seem to treat it like gibberish. Iwanaga and Martin's narrations end up translating whatever the story needs at the moment, rather than what's actually being said. One infamous example happens when Dr. Yamane is introduced in the American cut, which rearranges a scene from the Japanese version that happens later when Godzilla has already revealed itself. In the original, Yamane is talking about how indestructible Godzilla is, and argues that the creature should be studied to better understand it. You can even hear him say Gojira in this moment.
Gojira.
But in the American version, Iwanaga claims Yamane is suggesting they go to Odo Island to talk to the natives to see what they can uncover about these recent ship disasters. Is it culturally dismissive? Absolutely. In the extra scenes added for the American version, the so-called Japanese people were actually played by Asian American actors. Sometimes the characters will speak Japanese. It's not very good, but it's an attempt, I guess. There's also a noticeable difference in how the background characters behave from the original Japanese footage and the American added scenes. In the Japanese version, even minor characters bring a real sense of urgency, emotion, and energy to their roles. By contrast, the extras in the American scenes often look disengaged or stiff. A striking example of this is the ship sequence to Odo Island. In the Japanese version, the boat is full of energy and life. I mean, look how active everyone is here. But then you transition to the American scenes, and look at this. The extras act like puppets with wooden gestures and flat expressions. If it weren't for Steve Martin entering the frame in most of these scenes, the awkward acting would likely be more noticeable. Steve Martin's character isn't much better in terms of narrative contribution. Although he's positioned as the prominent figure of the story, he ultimately serves more as an observer than an active participant. He lacks a clear character arc or meaningful goal, aside from trying to see his so-called friend. He does get to interact with the main characters from the original film by way of body doubles. Since they weren't the real actors, their faces always had to be hidden when they were on screen with Martin. Upon closer inspection, you can kinda tell it isn't them, but it's still pretty cool that the filmmakers went through all the trouble to blend those scenes with the Japanese footage. Although Yamane's body double spends the whole conversation looking at Steve Martin's pants. I mean, come on, look up at least. So since Martin wasn't actually in the original film, he doesn't really have much control over what's happening. He's kinda just there. But I think the filmmakers realized how passive his role was, so they gave him one moment that actually matters. After the flashbacks wrap up, we cut back to the injured Martin, and that's when Emiko and Ogata show up. Emiko brings up Serizawa's invention, the one that could potentially stop Godzilla. In the Japanese version, she tells Ogata about the weapon, not just to spill the secret, but to help convince Serizawa to use it. It's a big emotional moment. It's not just about stopping Godzilla, it's about Emiko choosing to break a promise and possibly hurt someone she cares about, all for the greater good. But in the American cut, things play out a little different. It's Steve Martin who ends up convincing Emiko to go to Serizawa. So yeah, she still does spill the secret, but the emotional weight of that decision kinda shifts to Martin. He becomes the one pushing for the weapon's use, which downplays Emiko's role and basically cuts out the whole love triangle subplot. That internal struggle she had between love and loyalty is mostly brushed aside so Martin can be the guy who indirectly defeats Godzilla. Shifting that emotional moment to Martin kinda oversimplifies things and takes away from Emiko's arc. But despite all that, Steve Martin is not a bad character. Raymond Burr actually does a solid job in the role. He brings this calm, steady presence to the film, and honestly, he works well as our eyes and ears throughout this whole adventure. He never feels annoying or out of place, and his serious, grounded vibe gives the story a bit more weight, even if he's not a super developed character. One place where Steve Martin really shines, quite literally at times, is during Godzilla's second attack on Tokyo. During the sequence, Godzilla's rampage through the city goes on for about 13 minutes straight. And don't get me wrong, it's really awesome monster action. Watching Godzilla tear through buildings is exciting, but I have to admit, I start to feel a little checked out after a while. It's just a long stretch of non-stop destruction with not much else going on. But this is one moment where I think the American cut improves upon. The added Steve Martin scenes during the sequence break up the action in a really effective way. Every now and again we cut back to him inside a building, recording everything as Godzilla gets closer and closer. It adds tension and gives us a more personal perspective in the middle of all the chaos. It's also a smart way to get a main character directly involved into the film's big action moment. In the original, most of the key characters don't show up during the attack until the very end, and even then they're just watching from a safe distance far from the danger. Yeah, the original does cut to civilians during Godzilla's rampage, but it's usually just nameless extras we have no personal connection to. The whole flashback sequence wraps up, and we cut back to Martin all bandaged up. And from that point on, you can kind of feel the movie is rushing to the end. The whole struggle to convince Serizawa to use his invention is noticeably shorter, and the finale in Tokyo Bay is trimmed down too. And since this version isn't all that interested in the Japanese characters, a lot of their emotional moments get cut or glossed over completely. Dr. Yamane is the last major character to speak in the original film, delivering a somber warning that if nuclear testing continues, another Godzilla could appear. It's a little on the nose, but it ties everything back to the film's anti-nuclear message. Now, in the American version, that line is completely gone. Instead, Steve Martin is the one who gets the final word, announcing that the whole world can wake up and live again. Because I'm sure Godzilla will never show up again. Many fans will often say that the American version of Godzilla doesn't hit the same as the original Japanese film, and honestly, they're right. The 1954 Gojira is known for being way more than just a monster movie. It's a dark, powerful metaphor for nuclear devastation and Japan's trauma after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's very serious and has real emotional weight. But when the US version came out in 1956, a lot of that depth was stripped away. The US version cut a lot of scenes that dealt directly with Japan's post-war trauma, added a new character that really didn't do anything, and completely shifted the tone. In an interview with producer Richard Kay stated that he and his team were not focused on the film's anti-nuclear themes or deeper political messages. Their primary goal was to create a version that would resonate with American audiences. He then says, and I quote, "That's why we did what we did. We didn't fundamentally change the story, we simply presented it from an American point of view. Now, because of those changes, Godzilla King of the Monsters ends up feeling like your typical 50s sci-fi B-movie. But in that context, it's not bad. It doesn't try to change the world, it just wants to be an entertaining creature feature. And hey, it worked, because during its original US theatrical run in the 50s, it made over $2 million, which actually outperformed the original Japanese version. When it comes to an English dub, the 1956 cut is basically your only option, but it has its flaws. For one, it throws in random inaccuracies like saying Godzilla is 400 feet tall. But more importantly, it strips out the deeper themes the original was trying to explore. Now, I know some fans just prefer watching these movies in English, and that's totally valid. Not everyone wants to sit through subtitles. But the thing is, if you're only watching the American version, You're missing out on a remarkably well-crafted film for its time, one that's still considered one of the greatest Japanese movies ever made. Now that said, even that version isn't perfect. There are some awkward jump cuts in the original that, for whatever reason, were never reshot. The US version removes all those, except for one small moment where Emiko is about to cry. It also cuts out scenes that really don't go anywhere narratively. For example, there's a moment where Ogata stops Emiko, and essentially the story, to share the super important news that he's about to help Shinkichi with his studies. I'm sure Shinkichi's academic journey is really going to pay off in the grand scheme of things. Overall, I think it's best to see these two films as separate stories. One tries to deliver a deeper message while still being entertaining, and the other leans more into being a fun, action-packed monster flick. If you only have time to watch one, then yes, I definitely recommend checking out the original Gojira. But that doesn't mean the American cut isn't worth watching. After all, that's the movie that gave Godzilla his iconic title, King of the Monsters.